Okay, I think we're live. So, good afternoon, everyone. This is the third session of contributed papers in this colloquium, and this session we will have papers by Enrique, Louis, and Gabriel. And starting with Enrique, this is Enrique Aranda-Murillo. He's at the University of Granada, Spain, and today he'll present grounding fictional entities. So, Enrique, you have the floor.
Perfect. So, everything is right with the slides right now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So, before starting, I would like to thank Jersey and Italo for organizing this great conference. As a disclaimer, this is early stage work in progress, and I would really appreciate any comment or objection on it. The topic is the metaphysics of fictional entities. And in this respect, previously I have maintained a realist position, but due to some disconformities with my own position, I am proposing here an anti-realist view based on the notion of grounding. And it is strongly influenced by Tatiana von Solotkov 2019 paper. What I think explains better the nature of fictional entities. I hope this change, with this change, I hope I'm not disappointing any realist in the room for joining the dark side of anti-realism. But, well, the plan is as follows. First, I will briefly introduce the notion of fictional entity, the main issues on the debate between realist and anti-realist, and I will sketch my previous position within the realism and point out what part of it bothers me. In part two, I will introduce the position of von Solotkov called fictional grounding anti-realist, now on grounding anti-realist for short. I endorse most of her view, although I disagree with the grounding facts for fictional entities. So I will present in three an alternative view. I call it fictional institutional grounding anti-realism. Now on institutional grounding for short. Finally, I will summarize the talk and share some concerns with you. Okay. So, introduction. Well, what are fictional entities? Very quick, they are the reference of fictional names introduced by the author of a fictional discourse. So if you are an anti-realist, fictional names are empty names. If you are a realist, then they refer to some kind of entity. Paradigmatic examples of fictional entities are fictional character, such as Sherlock Holmes or Anna Karenina. But also fictional objects such as Excalibur, or fictional places such as Kumala or Macondo. A particular problematic case I will not address today is referent to real object in fiction. So it's Napoleon in War and Peace, the real historical character, or is not. Same with a place such as London in Sherlock Holmes stories. And the question about these fictional entities is, of course, what are their ontological status? So the one of the biggest debate in the philosophy of fiction is the debate between realism and anti-realism. Are there fictional entities? They exist or not? So there is an assumption shared by both parts of the debate. It's a parsimony principle that states that before theories with the same explanatory power, we should favor the one that postulate less entities. With this in mind, the realist position argue that postulating fictional entities is the best way to explain things such as the truth value of some sentences containing fictional names, the fact that we have mental intentional states about fictional entities, and they also maintain that since we accept the existence of entities that are similar to fictional entities, we can also accept the existence of fictional entities themselves. So the anti-realists confront these claims and argue that these cases can be covered without postulating fictional entities, so their position is preferable. Okay, I have held both in 2025 paper and in my PhD dissertation a realist position in the vein of Catherine Abel, head of the artifactualisms of Amy Thomason's. And this view consider fictional entities as social objects. They are objects that are created by means of declarations, and accordingly, they are temporary, they are reducible to physical objects, they are dependent of collective mental states, etc. But for me, at least, there are an intuitive difference in saying that spatio-temporal entities such as a chair, for instance, exists, or even an independent abstract entity such as a property or a color or whatever, that it's saying that it exists is different from saying that a fictional character exists. As I see, there is an intuitive difference in the sense of existence that we are using, and I think there are some approach to this different in Searle's distinction between institutional facts and brute facts. Institutional facts are those that depends of human collective intentionality, while brute facts are those that are independent of humanity. But still, I think that the notion of grounding it's way better in this respect to cover this difference. So. Well, my main reference in this work, as I said, it's von Solodkov paper explaining fictional character. She claims that theorists in both the realist and anti-realist position presuppose a meta-ontology position. This is a position about what is existing in a popular metaphor, what are the furniture of our world. And she responds that to be part of the furniture of our world, it's to be something to which we are ontologically committed. So this make a difference between two set of entities, the one hand grounded entities, on the other hand ungrounded entities, and only we are only committed to the latter, to ungrounded entities. So in a sense, what she's saying is that grounded entities don't exist. This is why it's her position. It's anti-realist because she will consider that we have no ontological commitment with fictional entities or fictional characters. So, in general, in order to explain the truth of sentences, including fictional names, the classic so-called semantic strategy is to paraphrase them, avoiding the reference to that names. However, as von Solodkov argued, there are cases in which this is problematic. Cases such as transfictional utterances, in which we compare characters from different fictions, or mixed utterances, where the fictional name is predicated with both internal and external properties. She argued that from the grounding perspective, the truth of those sentences can be explained in terms of the fact that grounds the fictional entity. So her view can explain the truth value of sentences containing fictional names while preserving a parsimonious ontology, because we have no ontological commitment to fictional entities. So in a way, they don't exist. And this allowed to get like the best part of both realist and anti-realist positions. So she considered that what remains on this is to explaining the nature of the grounding relation. That would be the task of the grounding theorist. So, well, according to von Solokov, the grounding anti-realism is guided by 4 principles. Those principles are modesty, which say that many ordinary claims about fictional entities are true. We will see an example in the next slide. The explanation principle that state that true claims about fictional entities can be fully metaphysically explained solely by the existence and properties of other entities. They are the grounding entities. So the grounding facts do not involve fictional entities. Since we are not ontologically committed to fictional entities, our ontology remain sparse. Okay, so an example of a sentence containing a fictional name is Wang. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character created by Conan Doyle. So Wang, it's true, following the previous principles, and it's true. It cannot be paraphrased, avoiding the reference to Holmes. This is the von Solokov argument. However, its truth can be explained without acquiring ontological commitment to Holmes, nor paraphrasing the sentence avoiding the reference of Holmes. This is the idea. So what grounds one and other facts about fictional characters, according to von Solokov, it's the illocutionary act performed by Doyle. And in her view, this act is an act of pretending to refer a real individual, or quasi refers to a real individual by using the name Holmes in this story. So up to this point, I mostly agree with von Solokov. However, I consider that her account of Doyle's illocutionary act is wrong. Hopefully, she acknowledged that it may happen, and she said about it that two grounding anti-realists could well disagree about what grounds facts about fictional entities, and hence they could disagree about which entities figure in the facts that do the explaining. And this is the case. I disagree with the funding facts, but I agree with the general framework. So, as I said, von Solokov endorses the pretense view. So, fictional entities are grounded on fictional discards. Fictional discards consist of acts of pretending to refer and acts to pretending to, let's say, asserting something about fictional names. This is the general idea. And there are many problems with the pretense view. Some of them are addressed in Berman and Franzen 2022 paper, which has been mentioned several times in this conference. But my favorite problem of the pretense theory, it's that acts of pretending are by definition unsuccessful acts, so they cannot be responsible for the normative change of fictional discards. Changes such as establish a standard of correctness for parafictional and metafictional utterances, because, as I said, they fail by definition in enacting that change. That what pretend means in part. Pretend something is not completely performed that act. So this is a problem, because if it's the illocutionary act which grounds the fictional fact, and the illocutionary act by definition it's unsuccessful, there is something wrong with the grounding fact. It can be argued that there are some convention or something in the vein of something similar to conventions, generation principles, things like that, in addition to the pretended act which grounds fictional fact. But given that von Solokov argued that it's the illocutionary act itself what grounds the fictional fact, I think the proposal it's helpless. Okay. So now let's move to my own proposal, my version of the grounding anti-realist. Well, I propose an alternative, and the idea is that the illocutionary force of fictive utterances is that of declaration. For those that who know my work, this is probably not surprising. So I think this offers some advantages, such as explaining the creative aspect and the creative aspect of the act of the author and the public nature of fictional entities. Well, Eric told us about it yesterday, so I will not stop here. However, illocutionary acts are not the only facts that ground fictional entities, as I see it. Other grounding facts are required to account for the persistence of those entities. What I think is that the institutional theory can give us these grounding facts, the entire explanation of how these grounding facts are, how these grounding facts grounds the fictional facts, and how ground the persistence of these facts. Okay, here I'm using shared institutional theory as framework. So accordingly, there are some ingredients that construct our institutional reality. The most fundamental is our linguistic capacity to perform speech acts, particularly some speech acts called status function declarations. In the case of fiction, I think they have the form, the name X count as having the property Y in the context in which X is used within a fictional discourse. I think that could be more or less the idea, which is kind of similar to Andrea's role proposal, I think, but still I'm not very confident about this formulation of the status function declaration, nor the status function itself. Probably they both need some refinement. So the function that the name fulfills display some properties within the relevant fiction. That's the idea, and as a result, the fictional discourse normative change. The fictional discourse generates normative change, such as the establishment of a standard of correction for some uses of language, namely parafictional and metafictional utterances. And for the persistence of the grounded fictional fact, it's also required collective recognition, which is also one of the ingredients of shared institutional theory. And the idea is that the character ceases to be grounded if it is no longer recognized, collectively recognized. Okay, so in short, applying to the previous example, one, it's true, because Conan Doyle ascribed some properties to the name Sherlock Holmes, and the audience recognized it, and that recognition raised some normative powers, particularly the powers that allow us to perform true, or I prefer correct, assertion about the content of the fictional discourse. Assertions such as, well, Sherlock Holmes is a human, Sherlock Holmes is a detective, Sherlock Holmes plays the violin, these kind of things. And the fictional facts are still grounded, while an audience recognizes that Sherlock Holmes has this property fictionally, have these properties within the fictional discourse. Okay, some conclusions. Well, pretty short. So institutional grounding share the advantages of the anti-realist grounding. So it preserves the advantage of von Solodkov position. However, I think it overcomes the problems associated with adopting the pretense view. And I also think that the institutional view give it a more robust theoretical framework. However, I think there is a tension between the metaphysician I would like to be and the philosopher of language I am. So, from a grounding theory, when I wonder about the reference names, I come up with 3 options, and none of them completely satisfies me. First option, it's the name referred to a non-existing object, and that put me close to a Magnonianism view, which I would like to avoid. Second option is that fictional names are empty, but if I maintain this position, there are problems about the capacity of sentences containing fictional names to express propositions, sentences such as one. So what the name contribute to the proposition, that is problematic. The third and last option is that sentences like one are paraphrases of the sentences that metaphysically explain their truth. However, I feel that the change of meaning between both sentences is too drastic. I don't think that a speaker would commit with saying that when he said something like one, he's saying something about Conan Doyle illocutionary acts or something the like. So that's my concerns with this proposal. There are very little references I have used, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique. Very good. We have time for questions, like 10 minutes. So please, Andreas.
Yeah, no, this is just a very short thing about the paraphrase strategy. So I agree with you, but I think the problem is really bad because, so like if you have if you say, for example, that what was your example? Fictional, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character, right? Yeah. Sherlock
fictional
Holmes is a
detective.
fictional character. So suppose you have someone who is confused and thinks Sherlock Holmes is real, right? And they say, oh, Sherlock Holmes, he was solving all these crimes. And then you say to them, no, you're confused. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character, right? I mean, it's just completely implausible to think that what you said to them was that according to X, Y, and Z, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character. I just don't think that that's any kind of explanation for the disagreement that you're having. So this is just like, I just want to say, yes, don't go for the paraphrase strategy.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think it's a bad option. I think that the probably the less bad, as I say, it's the Magnonianism kind of proposal in which you got two sets of entities, the grounded and the ungrounded. And the good part is that you got a very good way of maintaining a sparse ontology, because not everything you can ascribe properties exists or it's
there was an earlier version, there's another version of this paraphrase strategy. So that Brock argued for that in like 2002, which was that it's a paraphrase that says like, according to the realist, blah, 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 right? And this is the same kind of problem that if you say, oh, Sherlock Holmes, I think Queen Victoria met Sherlock Holmes, and you say, you're confused, Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character. I mean, surely you're not being told something about someone's theory, right? You're being told that Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character, right? Yeah, all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, Louis?
Yeah, good. So I'm not sure about Tatiana von Solodkov sort of meta-ontology here, but I guess, there's an argument to be made that she's actually a realist in disguise. And basically the idea is just like she seems to have a sort of reductive view of grounding, meaning that, what there is what there fundamentally is. But then, of course, like the realists in this debate have more like an emergence view of a grounding, meaning that what's grounded emerges from what's grounding, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm not sure how to adjudicate between these two views here, because especially if you go for Searle, I mean, obviously, anyone who follows Searle is not going to say states and borders and marriages do not exist because they are grounded on, more fundamental facts, because like the whole point of Searle is to have this emergence view, right? So I don't know. Either Tatiana and Searle cannot connect, or they can, but they're realists. That would be my dilemma, but I don't know enough about this, so I should, yeah, that's why I asked.
Yeah, I think in a way it's a realist position in disguise. In fact, I think it's not so different from the position I was holding before, but I think it's better explained. Like it reflects in somehow the difference between saying that a fictional character exists and saying that I don't know, a chair exists or the gravity exists, something like that. So I wouldn't be sad being called a realist and adopting a grounding position. For me, it's totally fine. I just try to put the ideas to reflect uh, these differences between entities. I don't really care if you say something like there are entities. They don't exist, but there are entities or things like that. But the idea is that there is a clear difference between grounded and ungrounded or ungrounded entities. So I'm just trying to reflect that in a way that also allows me to explain what I think it's an institutional nature. So that's why I'm using in Searle institutional theory, although I think I could use different institutional theory. I don't know, Wallace or something like that.
Okay. Okay, so I have a question. It's more of a clarificatory question. So in Searle's formulation, you mentioned X counts as Y in context Z, right? So
Yeah.
so correct me if I'm wrong, but you want to apply this to Y being the fictional character, right? So something counts as Sherlock Holmes or not? Because I find it difficult to find the brute facts in this case. What would be the brute facts that count as Sherlock Holmes, right?
Yeah, the brute fact would be the declaration that the name has some property, has the property of playing the violin or something like that. And why would be the property ascribed. So in that way, I think it kind of similar to Andrea's position, in which what you are doing is ascribing a property to a set.
But I don't think the declaration can be a brute fact, because a declaration is already something that imposes a status function upon a brute fact. So I don't know, perhaps just I'm being too strict on my reading of Searle. I don't know, but
No. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. I haven't considered it for this. So I think that the fictional name it's a kind of brute fact, but still there are some cases which there are freestanding y variable. So there is no brute fact in which the declaration is performed upon. So that could be one of these cases, but I think that the brute fact could be the name, not the concept, not the fictional character, but the name of the character. So
yes.
ascribing properties to a name, you create the concept, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's see, do we have more questions? No? Okay, so let's thank Enrique once again. And now we have a talk by Louis Rouillé, who is at the Universidade de Lisboa, Portugal, and who will present counterfictional uchronia as a test case for fictionality. So, Louis, you have the floor.
Okay, so now I'm unmuted. I guess you can see my slides. Okay. So yeah, so I changed the title because counterfictional uchronia was a bit of a mouthful. So I changed to reverse uchronia. And so basically what I'm going to do is present this case. So it's the first part of the talk is like, it's about this fun case of reverse uchronia. And then the second part of the talk is that these fictions nobody can account for, you know, and that'll be it. So what's the phenomenon? So maybe you know about uchronia. So uchronia is a genre. It's mainly like science fiction, but so it's a genre which explores the sort of what if scenarios, right? So what if the Nazis had won World War II? What if Africa had colonized Europe? So you have many examples, obviously. The idea is that uchronias share a common history with the real world until a pivotal event, right? Okay, it's quite important that it's world history that diverges. Otherwise, you get the view that any realistic fiction counts as uchronia, right? So, for example, Sherlock Holmes moving into 221B Baker Street is not supposed to be a pivotal event in history, right? So it's not like our history diverging until the point that Sherlock Holmes moves into this apartment, right? Another example is La Chartreuse de Parme. So Fabrice Del Dongo, he participates in the Battle of Waterloo, but you know, he doesn't do anything but look at what's going on, and the outcome of the battle is not changed. So that's not uchronia. Okay, so the upshot, or the sort of you know, what you need to, yeah, the take-home message basically is that realistic fictions take history, real history, as background, whereas uchronia it foregrounds real history. Okay, so that's the idea, and to get a small schema out of it, this is typically a uchronia, right? So okay, you surely have all these examples in your mind. Let's now look at reverse uchronias. Okay. So uchronias are fictions. So in principle, you can make a fiction within a fiction, right? And you can make a uchronia within a uchronia, okay? So in some cases, an author within the alternative history writes a uchronia with the same pivotal event as the frame uchronia, and it narrates our real world as history. Our real history as fiction, right? So it's going to be a reverse because you're coming back to the real world, okay? Interestingly, this practice of reverse uchronia is actually sort of conventionalized. So it was invented with uchronia. The first uchronia was a reverse uchronia, contained a fiction that comes back to it. So it's basically every uchronia is just playing with this. So it's not like a sort of weird case. It's really like, you know, a definitional of the genre in a way. And we can show this because, for example, if you look at Philip K. Dick, The Man in the High Castle, there's a uchronia within this. So the uchronia is like, what if, you know, Germany and Japan had won the World War in 1947, and then the story unfolds in 1962, right? And within this world, there is a weird book which is called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. And obviously, the reader expects that, you know, this uchronia within uchronia gets us back to reality because it tells about like, what if the Germans had lost the war? But there are like many differences which points to the fact that no, it's not our world, right? And this thwarts our expectations. Okay, so basically, the sort of normal case is reverse uchronia. So you get the frame uchronia, and the real historical development is just a branching from the point of view of the frame uchronia. And the embedded uchronia is just like, you know, going exactly the same as the real historical development. Okay. And so this is the normal case, and the sort of Philip K. Dick case is this one, which is like sort of, then we get lost in like alternative histories. Okay. So let me then develop one example because it's sort of fun, and then I'll make my argument against existing theories of fiction. So, as I said, this idea of treating real history as fiction is arguably sort of the hallmark of uchronias. It's actually why literary theorists have become interested in that. And here is a good case. So it's Louis-Napoléon Geoffroy Château, so Geoffroy. He has written a history about Napoleon, and the what if scenario is, what if Napoleon won the Russian campaign, you know? So he wasn't defeated in Russia. And then Napoleon eventually becomes sort of the rise ruler of the entire planet. So it's just like, it's amazing. This is like French rules for all time. It's one big monarchy. And then it has a lot of nice details about like technical and scientific achievements because humanity is just like, you know, going into one direction under the rule of a leader. And so you have like flying automobiles, typewriters, and stuff like this. So it's sort of this is what's going on in this fiction. At one point, Geoffroy has a chapter which is called Une prétendue histoire, a so-called history, in which he writes, "People have guessed my intentions, and they sense that I wish to speak of that so-called history of France from the capture of Moscow to the present day, a history embraced by some strange whim, which is reproduced everywhere in all manner of forms, and so widely disseminated that in centuries to come, posterity will doubt whether this novel is not in fact history." Okay? And then follows a sort of long description of all the restorations in Europe. So in France, in Italy, in Portugal, everywhere. And the chapter is obviously reverse uchronia because, you know, the restorations did happen. Geoffroy, thereby, in this setting, he presents our real history as an implausible course of events. And that triggers a sort of alienation effect, and that's the sort of crucial aesthetic effect, right? Here is Saint-Gelais on this one. Geoffroy skillfully exploits a reversal of perspective. Viewed from the alternate history world, historical reality is no longer subject to a judgment of truth, but rather, like a novel, a judgment of plausibility, from which it does not emerge unscathed. It is a dizzying passage which judges reality by the standards of fiction and leads even the least suspicious of readers to suddenly find it too good to be true, right? So this is the effect. This is the characteristic aesthetic effect. And I think current theory of fiction cannot quite capture this one. Okay. Okay, so let me try now and make the argument is perhaps a bit too much, but like make a case out of it. Okay. So here is the problem about embedding fictionality. Because obviously, I mean, I take reverse uchronia as a test case because it exists and it's sort of a genre. But obviously, you can also imagine some fantastic scenarios in which it's a fiction within a fiction, but there's no, you know, uchronia going on. And, you know, in the Lord of the Rings, someone sort of imagines our world for some reasons. You know, the aesthetic effect will not be as striking. That's why I guess it's less interesting. But in principle, the mechanism of embedding a fiction could be, instead of having one step further, you could go one step and then one step back. That's the idea, and that's the sort of structural problem. Okay, so reverse uchronias are a specific type of fiction within a fiction. And these, I claim, disturb our intuitions about the sort of embedding mechanism. Basically, adding a layer of fictionality should not change the logical status of a text. Okay, so the idea is just like, if a text is fictional, adding fictionality should not change it, right? And then people usually assume that a fiction within a fiction is a kind of fiction. It's just a, you know, a weird kind of fiction maybe, but still a kind of fiction. So now fiction within a fiction exists, they're possible. And so any account of fictionality should explain how embedding works. That's the least requirement we can have for a theory of fictionality, right? And I guess nobody really thought it through. Like in the literature, I've not seen like a paper where like fiction within a fiction, or like, you know, people going about with their theory of fictionality and making a chapter about fiction within a fiction. I guess nobody, really thought about it because it took for granted that such extension was basically trivial, right? So basically the idea is just like, whatever's your theory of fiction, in reality, then, it's the same theory that should explain what counts as a fiction within a fiction, right? You just shift the concept, the context, but then the explanation must be the same. However, my claim is that no existing account can explain the difference between a reverse and a non-reverse case of fiction within a fiction. So a fiction that goes deeper and a fiction that comes back to reality. And so all theories of fictionality fail to account for reverse uchronias and especially the aesthetic effect. And some, I claim, are even incompatible with it being the case. Okay. So I'll make this argument for, conveniently in a way. I'm not here doing the sort of analysis of all the views of fictionality in the literature. I don't have time for this, but then basically I'm just piggybacking on like what's usually taken to be like the three main views of fictionality in the field, and so I'll go through them in order, and then we can discuss whether they fail or not. This is the point. Okay, so I'm going to do pretense theories, then directive theories, then declaration views. Okay, so here is, suppose you're a pretend theorist. Okay, so suppose you think that a text is fictional as opposed to non-fictional or factual or whatever. So a text is fictional whenever it is pretend asserted, right? Then I think the idea is that we have a fiction within a fiction whenever a text is pretend asserted within the fiction, right? So you basically need someone who pretends assert something within the fiction, and that makes a fiction within the fiction, right? This case is, I think it doesn't rule out the sort of reverse mechanism, but I take it that it cannot make the difference between the sort of reverse kind and non-reverse kind. Okay. So basically it's just like, yeah, you pretend. So pretense is just telling you you're going outside your world to just like describe another world. And then you're there. And then pretense tells you you're going outside of your world to describe another world, but it doesn't tell you, anything else. Moreover, I think it's sort of dubious in this theory that sort of two acts of pretense can cancel each other. I've not seen that, made in the literature. There's this literature about like, dynamic pretenses and like, you drink the cup that's pretend full and then it's pretend empty, but you're within the same pretense, right? I'm talking here about like, you pretend, I pretend to be someone else, and that someone else pretends to be me. Is that possible? Is that possible to cancel a pretense like this? Okay, so at least that should raise doubts about how pretense theorists will account for this. But prima facie, what they need that they don't have is not only, as they have now, a sort of starting point and mechanism for pretense. So pretense theory is basically give me your starting point and I give you a mechanism to go into the pretend space. And now what they need is something like a direction for the pretense, whatever that means, So going further down the fiction path or going back to reality. And this, I think, is just like doesn't exist in the present literature. So pretense theorists, not too bad, because in principle they could extend their view to count for reverse cases, but not clear they can do it, and sort of dubious that they would do it because of this like pretense canceling each other, which I'm not sure it makes sense. Okay, let's go for directive theories. So now suppose you're a directive theorist. So you say that the text is fictional as opposed to non-fictional whenever it instructs the reader to imagine rather than believe its content, right? And then you have some, you can go into details. It's because of the author's intention if you're a Gracian, but it could also be because of a convention. So here you can think of Stock and Manolo as two, two kinds of directive theorists on this one. Okay. So, okay, let's suppose that's the case. Then, of course, if you embed, then you embed. So we have a fiction within a fiction whenever there is a text that is either intended to be fictional. So we have an author within the fiction who intends to present a fiction within its world, or there is a convention. It's probably the same convention as we have here. It's just like reality principle that gives you this. And so we read it as a fiction within a fiction. Okay. In this case, I think it's interesting because I think reverse cases lead this theory of stray in a way, because in this case, you have a sort of conflict of conventions or conflict of intentions, because the fictional author directs the reader to imagine, but the real author directs the reader to, and then it should not be imagine because there's no tongue. Sorry, so there's a typo. But the real author directs the reader to believe, right? Because the reader is supposed to recognize that this is the real world that's presented now, right? So the author knows what they're doing, but the fictional author is just like doesn't know that they're addressing real readers. So the conflict in instructions here, I think, is resolved in favor of the real author. Otherwise, I claim that we lose the aesthetic effect because we need to actually believe from the standpoint of the fiction within the fiction, but still we need to believe. And so whatever makes the text fictional within the fiction is sort of trumped by the real author's instructions to recognize the text as non-fictional or the content as factual. Okay, so I think, I mean, otherwise, these guys can tell me, but I think the real author here is definitely like, the one who trumps. I mean, his intentions win, basically. So the question they have is, how can we sustain the sort of fictional author's viewpoint in order to get this alienation effect? Because I think the real author just like, crushes the fictional author's intentions. And recall, yes, I said the fictional author's intentions. So, Geoffroy, the narrator of Geoffroy, his intention is not to match reality because they don't know about reality, basically. And they want to make something up. But of course, we recognize reality. Okay, good. So directive theories, again, not that bad, but it's sort of weird because these conflicts of intentions or instructions have not been studied, and they should be studied before we know exactly what's going on. And I claim that the aesthetic effect is basically, yeah, sort of impossible to retrieve, maybe, or I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you'll tell me what you think. Then let's go to the third case, which is declarative theories. So now you're a declarative theorist, and you say, we've heard this from Enrique just before, a text is fictional whenever an author performs a specific declarative speech act whose effect is that the fictional content is made true in the fiction, and in some version it's created. But let's not go into the details. Okay, so we have this specific declarative speech act. The consequence, obviously, for a fiction within a fiction is that the declarative speech act should be made within the fiction, right? Here, I claim we have a clear case of impossibility of sort of the reverse case. Why? Because unless magic is real, one cannot declare real history into existence. So the fictional author has no capacity to declare real history into existence. I mean, arguably, you can declare some institutional facts into existence, but clearly not physical events and not like, winning a war or anything like this. And in this case, since the fiction within the fiction is not true by accident, again, it's just like the whole point is to look at real history from the standpoint of fiction. It means that the sort of non-fictional parts of the fiction within the fiction, it cannot be fictional. So consequently, the looking at real history, qua real history, through the lens of fiction is not possible. So they basically argue that this case is not possible, but of course, reverse uchronia do exist. I gave you one example, so, the problem is not with the example, the problem is with the view. And here I'm sort of, I don't know how to get around this. Maybe Enrique, you have thoughts about this, but I think the sort of the creative aspect of declarative views here is just like a killer. Okay, well, so by the end of this talk, you should be like, oh, we have a problem and we have so many fictions to read. So I hope you will have you will read these, and of course, I'm waiting for the rejoinders you can think of for your favorite theory. And I leave you with this nice citation. By Jeanette, as the linen is nothing other, according to Valérie, than digesting lamb, fiction is nothing other than fictionalized reality. And of course, I thought it was fun because it's a citation within a citation, so it's sort of the topic of the talk is formally reflected. Okay, I'm done, and I wait for your questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Louis. So we have time for questions. Yes, Elisa.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. This is very funny. I have a question about the fact that my personal impression with the example you gave is that the reader, as a matter of fact, maintains two perspectives, one from the inside of the fiction and the other from the outside of the fiction. So, and this is something which we can adopt even with other fiction. So it is fictionally the case that something is happening, but then we may want to compare it with what is going on in reality. In those cases, it seems to me that this is something which is very strong in the perspective of the reader. So the fact that the theory you have considered, they can, I think, try to defend themselves, saying, but I'm trying to say what is fictional. And within fiction, reality is a fiction. And then whatever happens from the reader outside is something which doesn't concern fiction. I was wondering what would you answer to that kind of objection?
Yeah, good. I mean, but so I think the parallel reading should be taken very seriously. So it's so in the case, so suppose suppose you take Geoffroy and you say, is it the case in the fiction within the fiction that Italy is restored into a monarchy? In the fiction, it's not true because Napoleon rules. But in the fiction within the fiction, it's true because, that's what the fiction within the fiction says, right? So clearly there's in one sense, the content of the fiction within the fiction is, you need to get it from this route of fiction within the fiction. But then the parallel reading is forced upon us because we realize the real author's intention that the fiction within the fiction's content is non-accidentally true. So I still think that you need to have like a representation of history, a representation of the fiction within the fiction, and a recognition that the two content either overlap or like match completely.
But do you need it in the fiction?
Yeah, but I think like Italy is restored back into a monarchy. It is true in the fiction within the fiction. So it's fictional in one sense. It just happens that, so, you cannot just evacuate saying, oh, but that's non-fictional. No, the point is that it's fictional with fictional. Otherwise, you don't get the effect. Otherwise, you're just like, yeah, well, I know this story by heart. That's the idea, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mero?
Yeah, so thanks, Louis. That was super interesting. So I hope I understood the problem that you sketch correctly, but I'm not too sure. So I was sort of triggered by something that you said at some point, that the real author is directing the reader to believe the stuff that he writes in that embedded fiction, right? And so then I wondered, well, does he? Because in order for the audience to actually recognize that embedded fiction as this interesting stuff that's really true, then about the actual world, and the audience already should, they should already believe all of those things, right? So he doesn't really want to inform anyone, right? Or he doesn't really want to, yeah,
No,
make
okay,
us believe
that's fair
anything.
enough. No, that's
Yeah,
fair enough. It's not
and then
yeah.
more generally, so I mean, this whole sort of question reminds me of the debate on export, right? And truth in fiction, and so also in that context, I'm not entirely sure I get the problem, right? So okay, yes, we have a fiction in a fiction, and the fiction in a fiction describes all sorts of things that are also true about the real world, and the audience will recognize that and is supposed to recognize that. But yeah, and then I don't really see why that is a problem for these theories, but maybe that's just because yeah, didn't
I mean,
understand.
one provocative way of seeing the problem is just like, the fiction absorbs reality. It's just like, it's not like export is this idea that, you get into the pretense and you get back to reality and poof, you have something new. You've thought about it and then you're just like, oh, I get something new about reality because I learned. And of course, then, if it's the case of basic learning, it's just like whatever you found there was actually coming from reality through the sort of reality principle, and the export is supposed to be the way back, right? But in this case, it's more tricky. It's more like, you go there, and then where you come from, the reality is just absorbed into another world, which is embedded within it. But that's not possible. That's not metaphysically possible. It's just something you need to imagine. So then the aesthetic, I think the phenomenon, so structurally we see the what it's like. Then you're just like, well, yeah, I don't care because I have a theory which tells me how to go from one point to another, so I could go I don't care. But then I think the aesthetic effect is the crucial sort of phenomenon to explain, which is basically the idea that literary theorists look at is just like, if you look at a book of history, you look at this book of history and then you judge it via, truth. So is it true? Do we have compelling evidence and stuff like this? But if you look at the same content through the lens of a fiction within a fiction, you look at history saying like, this is implausible, And so then you can look at our real history, like this cascade of restorations after Napoleon is something like, but this is mad. Real history is mad, But this is not the kind of attitude you could have when you read, history straightforwardly. That's the idea. So the phenomenon is really like on how you represent the same content. And yeah, that's the idea. And then in principle, you could have like a frame fiction of maybe one sentence or only paratext, and then only only a history book, and then you read a history book as if it was fiction or something like this, if you want to really make the example, philosophically interesting, or yeah.
But then
That's
can't
the idea.
the theories that we have help you actually explain that aesthetic effect? I don't see why it's a problem for those theories.
Because I think they cannot get the parallel reading. They don't have the resources to give us parallel reading. They tell us how to get from one world to another, but they don't tell us how to sort of stratify our representations. That's my claim. It's a bold claim. Maybe I'm wrong, but at least nobody has, developed that theory so that it explicitly accommodates for these cases. Yeah.
Maybe the way that I understand it is just like, okay, so you have that embedded fiction, and then the reader will at some point recognize, oh, it's like this is basically the story about the actual world. And then you have the mapping that you talk about, and then the theories of fiction that are already out there can then help explain why that mapping leads to this interesting aesthetic experience or something like that.
I mean, good. I think it remains to be done, and I
Yeah,
think I get
right.
some, ideas that it's more complicated than it sounds.
Yeah.
But again, maybe it's just a trivial extension, and I overmade my case.
Okay, great. We're out of time for questions, but thank you once again, Louis, and this discussion can continue during the break. So, Italo and Enrique, feel free to, if you're going to stay, Louis, during the break, so we can continue the discussion. And so now we have Gabriel, where are you? Okay, so let me spotlight you. So now we have Gabriel Andersen Eugênio from the Universidade Estadual de Campinas, Unicamp, who will talk about quadrinistic and quadrinizing in the debate on the philosophy of fiction. So go ahead, Gabriel.
Can you see my slides? Yeah.
Yes.
So hello, I'm actually in a kind of work in progress in this presentation. This is something that I'm trying to write with Renato, which is here. And it's an idea we have reading some things in historical of comics and something like that, and we come with these terms called by Moacir Cirne, which is a Brazilian historian about comics. And let's see, I don't know if this have a very philosophical consequence, but I want to know. I hope they have. So quadrinizing the debate of philosophy fiction. Very thanks to Renato to accept working with me. The introduction. Well, the debates in philosophy fiction usually concentrate on discussions about literary narratives, but as we see, the comic books have a fruitful field of discussion about fiction. We could ask about this presupposition, this pretense view about fiction, which kind of speech act is in case when you're doing comic narrative. But in this presentation, I want to focus on what are the distinctive features that characterize the comics. Some could say that it would be sequentiality, a blend of text and drawings, the comic balloons. But as I see, none of this is sufficient to the definition of comics. So in this context, we believe that the terms quadrinistic and quadrinizing can help us explore this topic. A little disclaimer, we choose not to translate into anglicize the term quadrinho, which is in Brazilian, Portuguese Brazilian, which is translatable to comic, but we think that quadrinho refers to something bigger and wider than comics, because let's say that, for example, in English we have comics and graphic novels, and quadrinho refers to both of them, and also because it was the terms used by the historian Cirne, which we will mention. So we choose not to translate, but to adapt the quadrinho. In Portuguese would be quadrinístico e quadrinizante. We choose to adapt this to English instead of just translating to comicalistic and comicalizing. This talk then aims to introduce and analyze this concept mentioned, And we try to introduce this concept by applying the conceptual engineering that Amy Thomason presented in her last book, Rethinking Metaphysics. So the table of contents, I will start to look at the conceptual engineering, which is the method we use to analyze these terms. But the main topic is on part 3, which is the Quadrinistic and Quadrinizing. So concept engineering. A digression about function is an idea that a pragmatic approach to concept engineering is used to fundament and to motivate the revising or re-engineering the concepts and the terms they use. And it's inspired by the functional linguistic. The main approach in linguistics is the systemic functional linguistics. And basically what we mean when we say about functioning concept engineering is that what we can do with the language that we couldn't do without it. And quote, in any case, knowledge of a linguistic function can give grounds for assessing various proposals in conceptual engineering in terms of how well they enable the term to serve their relevant function. So one possible origin of the concept engineering is Rudolf Carnap, which coined the term explanation used by philosophy to explain or explicate the terms for science. So when we have a relative inexact concept, which we need to make more exact so that it can function better in our scientific theories. Thomas goes ahead and shows that in Rethinking Metaphysics that this thing that Carnap presents to science, we could go wider and do with other areas in philosophy, like John Wisdom, Alison Brose, and Mary Midley have done. Mary Midley has this analogy, which is very fun. But other authors that have worked with re-engineering concepts and without associate this concept engineering sciences, Stella Hasleger, re-engineering the concepts of race and gender, and Kevin Sharp, re-engineering the concepts of truth. Then Thomas identifies 4 situations in which we need to reform or create new concepts. One situation is where we need concept engineering for resolving or rephrase our theories in order to avoid puzzles and paradoxes. So when we encounter a paradox, we have 3 options. Or we can reverse engineer the concepts, and by having a better understanding about the function of the concepts, we could get rid of the puzzle. We can re-engineer the concepts, or we can get rid of the concept. Another case is when a term or a concept have a function, but the function is inactualized, is not current, because we have new scientific discoveries, and with these new scientific discoveries, we think that, for example, these terms don't fulfill well the function they have. For example, Carnap had this term use this to exemplify explanation, which is fish, the term fish, which could be a long time ago aquatic animal, but aquatic animal does not fulfill the function we need to have with the term fish nowadays. So we change the function of this term so they can fulfill with the new function actualized by the new discovery in science. In such case, we ask ourselves how to reform concepts in light of advances in scientific discoveries. A third situation is when a concept fulfills its function, but that function is one we do not believe that should be fulfilled. In other words, we believe that we should get rid of the function served by the concept. So we have here the concepts that promote or invoke some kind of problematic treatment or exclusion, respect, or prejudice. And the main example about this case is pejoratives. And the final situation when we need concept engineering is when a new technology or scientific theory are developed, and then we need to create new concepts. The case involves a situation in which a new vocabulary is demanded in order to talk about some discovery or innovation. So some examples could be said in these situations. For example, the case of flu, or the case of app, which is a term that refers to something that didn't exist in the past. So now we have this term to refer to this kind of new technology. So summing up these situations, we have internal problems, problems that lead us to puzzles and paradoxes. We have the failure of perform a certain function, which is the case of fish that doesn't have the function anymore. The concepts that have problematic functions, like pejoratives, and when we need to fulfill a new function, like the terms like app or technological terms. And then we have a success criteria for the situation that have a puzzle paradox. The success is resolving the relevant paradoxes, or for example, the fulfillment of function when we have the failure to perform a certain function, or break problematic promotion of the promotion of problematic treatments when have the situation where concepts that have problematic functions, or see if the concept is fulfilling the new function created. So this is the basic thing about concept engineering. And then in Thomason, it should be right, but we have to, in our work, we need to apply these notions of functions and concept engineering in order to revise or give a delimitation of what could be these terms like quadrinistic and quadrinizing that Moses Cern is using in this historical text. In his book, História e Crítica dos Quadrinhos Brasileiros, in English would be History of and Criticism of Brazilian Comics, Moses Cern uses two concepts, quadrinistic and quadrinizing, in an effort to outline a historiography of Brazilian comics. However, the author employs these terms without providing a clear explanation or definition. It's not a philosophical book, it's actually a historiographic book. So because of that, he don't define these terms. He just uses these terms in order to stabilize what would be a feature that could be potentially in the language of comics, and what would be the aspects, the features that is intrinsic or is inside the institutional language of comics. And a preamble of Cern's concerns with this book. For Cern, the existence of quadrinizing property supports a certain primacy of the Brazilian comic book, which is an example that he showed, but I'm not using too much. See that it's a comic string, but we don't have the balloons, which is characteristic, could be characteristic for comics. We just have the figures and the text, and they don't dialogue between them. So some quotations about the Moses Cern is that this quote is to see and to delimitate what in which cases he's using these terms, and then we could see what functions he wants these terms to serve. So I outlined something like that. In truth, these titles, like others, especially European ones from the same period, are characterized more by narrative features than that would be considered quadrinizing, rather than strictly quadrinistic. As we have already stated, it was only the first decade of the century that the comic established itself as a systematized language, the articulation of verbal and non-verbal symbols as a symbolic narrative practice. So as we see, quadrinistic is more associated with something established by an institution and something like a language of and conventional language of the comics. Another case where he used these terms is, in addition to being a word, both graphic and thematic, crafted by Agustin, which is the example I showed later. As Aventuras de Joaquim contains the key sign-based elements of quadrinizing narrative, starting with the semiotic meaning of the storytelling. So he points that some features in comics have the semiotic meaning of that are associated with storytelling in narrative, in comic narrative, but it's not inside the institutional of the conventional language of comics. And then dissertation that uses this distinction that CERN coined, but doesn't mention, doesn't define very well what is quadrinistic modernizing. But in a footnote, Jefferson Jacques mentioned and pointed some definition wannabe about these terms. Quadrinistic refers to what is commonly identified as comics, as it possesses certain characteristics common to the medium, though not necessarily structural ones. Quadrinizing refers to works with characteristics that are still developing, such as potential for sequentiality and narrative. Thus, we observe that the concept seems quite useful for distinguished characteristics in comics. If we try to abstract some kind of function about these quotations, the institutionalized aspect of the language of comics is what we call as quadrinistic, and with the aspects with the potential to be part of the language is what we call quadrinizing. This function seems important in the endeavor to define comics or even to understand better this form of storytelling. I will present some examples that could motivate this research about this distinction, and based on what CERN has presented. But the important points to note in the example that I will show is how the language is used without using speech balloons or onomatopoeias, how they use sequentiality, the gutter, the caricature, which is also very associated with comics, or the relationship between text and image. So an example that it's really common use as a primeval comic is this cave paintings, which we could have some kind of sequentiality, or I don't know, some caricatures, but we have a clear storytell with images, and then it's usually associated with comics. When we go to this image, we see that sequentiality is not a thing, is not consensus in the comics. We have something that is more instant. We have a figure that this all in there is instantaneous. we have this, that the gutter functions in another way, and then the sequentiality is also broken. And this in which we didn't have any balloons, and we see clearly the storytelling. So my final considerations, as I said, I don't know if this have too much philosophical implications. I hope it has, but what we try to make here is using this methodology that Thomason presents and see what how this historian terms like quadrinistic and quadrinizing could help us in find which aspects in comics are distinctive about comics and which is just historically associated with comics, but is not part of the institutionalized and conventionalized language of comics. Thus, trying to make a reverse engineering interpreting what CERN wants to do with the terms, quadrinistic and quadrinizing, we think that the function of these terms is to delimitate certain historical features that could be and sometimes actually are attributed to comics. Distinguishing these historical features can give us a better understanding on what we have to consider as important in studying the language of comics. It also helps us to explain why certain things that are not comics, according to Joe's definition, seems like comics. As we studied, we saw that many definitions could have been raised about this thing, but some of them uses aspects of comics that it could be more historical than intrinsic to this language, as I said. And then I think that one advantage is that we could differentiate better which things are comics and which things seems like comics and why it seems like comics and it's not part of this institution. We did not reach a definite conclusion, but the goal was to encourage reverse engineering in the vein of Carnap's explanation of the term quadrinistic and quadrinizing. And we believe that examining the function of these terms can shed light on the concepts that remain quite unclear. A possible advantage that I think is that by using this distinction, we could trace the difference between, for example, manga and comics in terms of institution. It might be the case that although they share quadrinizing features, that is, the historical potential features to be inside of what we call as comics, they are regulated by another language, and so they don't share quadrinistic features. And a point we should take care in the future is whether if you wouldn't be better if you have two kinds of quadrinizing features. So let's now say that the function of quadrinizing is not to pick a historical potential to be inside of language of fiction, language of comics, but is to pick out the attributes that could potentially be incorporated into the institutional language of comics. So maybe we need to have two types of quadrinizing feature. One of them is this historically, where the features that are not yet attributed to comics but were eventually institutionalized. Another one for potential no historical. So some examples that is that if one day it becomes standard practice to include playlists in comics, then would it be part of our conventionalized language of comics? Or let's say that X becomes a conventional element in comics, then would X be a part of our language of this institutionalized comics? Would X be quadrinistic? Well, I think that's it. That's my references, and thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. We have a little bit over 5 minutes for questions. So, yes, Elisa?
So thank you very much. The comics are really, really very nice, and it is a fascinating topic. I was wondering whether is this really conceptual engineering, which is the case, or more something like hermeneutics or of the text. So can you explain to me why it is really conceptual engineer and not hermeneutics? That's the question.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I don't want to talk over Thomason about her work, but and I don't know too much about hermeneutics, but as she said in her latest book, the Rethinking Metaphysics, the work that philosophy needs to do to be relevant and to be in order to be uh, great for in academic levels is to analyze linguistically the terms and analyze the linguistic functional of the terms, and some kind of work hand in hand with the linguistics. So yeah, maybe this kind of work involves some kind of hermeneutic, because we are trying to analyze the historical term and terms that are used in another area of knowledge. But as soon as we encounter some philosophical problems to work with these new things, new concepts, which is in this case is quadrinistic and quadrinizing, I think now we are bringing these concepts to philosophy and not hermeneutics. But yes, I think it involves some kind of hermeneutics.
Which one of the four way in which Thomason characterize engineering is the one you are proposing for quadrinistic quadrinizing? Was not to me very clear. Say that, and then I leave space to Louis. Sorry.
Yes, nice. I think it's the second one. I think the one I put is it's like the explanation point in Carnot. We have a concept that have a function, and this function needs to be actualized, and then we revise these terms and these concepts in order to bring us new advantages in our current theories.
Okay,
I think it's the explanation point in Carnot, not the other one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Louis?
Yeah, good. So I mean, I take the point to be a sort of exploration of genre constructions and stuff like this. So, you know, independently of whether you want to frame it as conceptual engineering, but there's still like a sort of historical point that conventions have a beginning, they develop and stuff like this. And so in this context, and maybe it's a question for you, or maybe it's the question for the author you're working on, but how do you think like specific examples are useful in this area? Do you think that because you know he manifestly relies on one first example, right? Uh, it was in Portuguese, so I cannot say, but you know you showed the strip, right? And So do you think he has a view, or maybe you have a view that, there's a first instance and then it get imitated, and it's because it's imitated that it becomes a convention? Or do you think there's another view in the background? Because that's, what I presupposed, but maybe there's a bit of a logical space here.
I think that this is useful because of just because of this, because let's see that as we see the example of the cave paintings, some authors could say that this is the beginning of the comics institution. So, but what we are trying to say in using these concepts is that these things bring some elements that could be traced back nowadays, which is historical quadrinizing features. But in that century, they don't have this institution, and so it's not a quadrinistic case. It's not that they don't have institutionalized and conventionalized language of comics. I don't know where to point in the history of where it has begun. Well, the Brazilian work, the most recent, is trying to point at the Brazilian comic strips and say this is the one that started this institution. But if you look at the historical American historical about comics, they would say that it was maybe a Superman that started this institution. I don't know. But
no, it's Little Nemo in the US. It's clearly Little Nemo
yes,
from 1900, something like this. So it's way
yes.
before like the comics. But yeah.
But I think I don't have the historical response to that, but I think these terms could help us to find this board, this limit. Until then, they have quadrinizing features. They have features that could be inside of an institutional that nowadays we call comics, but they aren't at the time. And now at our time we call it comics.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for all the presenters of this session, Louis, Gabriel, and Enrique. So